And that's a fairly large mission. Oh, thank you, Jenna, for starting the recording there. So that's a pretty big mission, and the way that we do it is largely through citizen science volunteers, including tonight's speaker, Wayne Humphries. So citizen scientist volunteers are people just like you who donate their time and their energy to basically go out birding and report what they see. And each year, more than 70,000 volunteers participate in Birds Canada programs nationwide, which is a mind-boggling number. Birds Canada is a recent arrival here in Newfoundland, so we've only been established in the province since 2019, and we run 2 programs here. The first is the Newfoundland Breeding Bird Atlas, which is a 5-year citizen science effort to map the distribution and the abundance of all of the breeding bird species on the island of Newfoundland. Clearly, this is a pretty huge task, and we depend very, very heavily on citizen science volunteers like Wayne and like John Goss, who's here tonight and is one of our regional coordinators. And then the second program we run is the Atlantic Canada Nocturnal Owl Survey. So this survey is a little bit different. It takes place in a limited time frame for 6 weeks from the 1st of April to the 15th of May every spring. And what happens is volunteers take on a pre-established route of 10 stops, and they go out and survey that route just one night within that 6-week period and listen for owls and report their, I was going to say sightings, but I guess it's more like hearings. And both of these programs are always looking for volunteers here in Newfoundland. So if you're interested in either of them, you can send us an email. And Jenna, I think, can put our email in the chat. It's nlatlas@birdscanada.org. And then just before we get going, I'd like to thank our funders. These are the partners and supporters of the Atlas, and they make events like those that we're holding tonight possible. And then finally, I would like to introduce tonight's speaker, Wayne Humphries, who, as you've probably already guessed, is an avid birder. And I said he's a volunteer for many Birds Canada's programs. And he's actually also a recent master's graduate. So it sounds like convocation was actually within the last couple of weeks. Is that right, Wayne?
Correct. Last Thursday.
Last Thursday. All right. So congratulations from all of us. So Wayne was born here in Newfoundland in Bonavista North. In an area with a long history of turr hunting, and he completed his Bachelor of Science at Memorial. Oops. All right. Well, that's an interesting slight pause there. Let's go back to actually sharing. So he completed his Bachelor of Science at Memorial before working for the provincial government for a fairly long period of time, it looks like. First as the Executive Secretary of the House Royal Commission on Employment and Unemployment, and then as Commissioner of the Economic Recovery Commission. Eventually, he did leave the province. He moved to Ontario to take on the position of Chief Operating Officer for a real estate development company. But like many Newfoundlanders, Wayne found the call of Newfoundland too strong, and he has moved back to the province, which we at the Atlas are very pleased to hear. And he's been pursuing a master's in environmental studies at York University, and that's what he's going to tell us about tonight. So Wayne, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you very much. So I guess I can share. Am I sharing? Right.
Yep.
No. Can you?
Nope. Just hit the share screen.
Yep, I'm there. So share. Just.
There you go.
Good. If I got the right one. No, I got the wrong one. I'm sharing. Am I? Yep. Just hold a second. I'm sharing the wrong screen.
You are?
I think so. Are you seeing the importance of public engagement?
Yes. Yeah, we're seeing. All you have to do is hit the presentation button, the slideshow button down at the bottom there. And I think we should be seeing, yeah, you got it.
Here we go. Got it. So so thanks, Catherine. I will take you through a little series of slides, and I'll ramble a bit, and hopefully from the rambling, you will get some meaningful information. I sort of will walk through basically an introduction, talk a bit about the research objectives of the work that I did, and also get into this concept or notion of a murre turr, because that to me was one of the bigger surprises that I found in terms of how that is defined in rural Newfoundland. We'll also talk a little bit about the historical politics of turrs and and get into where the study area was, the methods, and some of the findings and some of the implications. So I want to make a major point here, and that is you don't have to be a scientist to contribute to science and policy. And here, for some people that might know it or might recognize this, is actually the lady Eason out of Lumsden that's been doing research for a number of different students over the years, primarily in Bonavista Bay and off Cape. And unfortunately, about 5 or 6 years ago, I got an opportunity to spend the night with these individuals, basically doing, at that time, we were actually tagging shearwaters and also retrieving sounders that were recording whale sounds in Bonavista Bay. And here you've got two former fishermen who are doing their part to contribute to science, and including in my own situation. I'm not a seabird biologist by any stretch of the imagination. I'm a birder like most everybody here. But I was fortunate enough to get pissed off with work one day, and driving home, I decided to pull into a parking lot and say, okay, I'm giving you 6 months, and then promptly enrolled in the master's program at York University, and with a plan of basically of coming back to Newfoundland and trying to sort of further my interest in birding and also research. And I was very, very fortunate to have met Gail Fraser, who had done her PhD at Memorial, and she was a prof at York. And Gail sort of took me under her wings, and at the end of the day, I was able to make my way through this thing. The other thing about York was that York had a program whereby for seniors like myself, you got free tuition, and then on top of that, I was able to get a $20,000 fellowship. So here I am now back in Port Blandford permanently until the next stage of my life, I guess. So I want to talk a little bit about policy, and that is policy is rarely based on science, and it would be very simple if it was, but it's not. Politics, societal values, economics influence conservation policy in a significant way, and you'll see that very, very clearly as I go through this particular presentation and how it played itself out in the turr hunt in Newfoundland. One of our basic issues that we have is that marine ecosystems are very, very complex and very, very much influenced by anthropocentric uses. And I threw this word in, anthropocentric, simply because the first day of class, the prof mentioned anthropocentric, and I had no idea whatsoever what that meant. And thank God for Google, I found out very quickly what it is. So I'll throw around anthropocentric a bit, simply because I want to use a big word every now and then. So what happens in the situation with our marine ecosystems, we have a fundamental problem, and that is, other than the environmental impacts, the number or the amount of resources that are applied to marine research are very small in comparison to what's used for terrestrial environmental research. And therefore, we have to begin looking at other forms of research strategies to be able to complete, to have a more comprehensive picture of what's happening, or at least get some sense. So recently, there has been a debate that started to emerge on the need to re-examine the structure of coastal marine governance. And that is, rather than operating in silos, you need to move towards one where you've had stronger relationships between community and the environment, policy integration, and multi-level governance. And really, that was what sort of drove me to begin looking at this project in Bonavista North, because what I really wanted to get at was there a mechanism, or are there mechanisms by which you can involve local people in providing input into policy? So the fundamental questions are, first of all, can local knowledge be used to assist in breaking down the barriers between science, policy, and the public? And is there an opportunity to involve stakeholders in managing marine resources? at the same time provide and enhance scientific literacy, environmental awareness, resource stewardship, and build trust between resource managers and the stakeholders. And the problem we have, and there are many, many problems, and particularly the turr hunt or conservation policy related to the turr hunt is very, very complex. And what we so we only have essentially a number of resources. It's not like we have. It's not like it's a terrestrial issue where we have lots of bird watchers and people walking the parks and so on can document sightings and notice changes in behavior, particularly whether it's you know birds, passerines, or coyotes or whatever. The only resources we have from a human resources point of view to assist in this are primarily those that live in coastal communities. And at the same time, there are those that actually execute, or those that use those resources, like fishermen and even, for example, people like those that prosecute the recreational fishery, and those on ocean-going vessels, and those that even for a day end up on the water. So we need to begin to start thinking about how we can use these individuals in a more comprehensive fashion and organized fashion than what we've done in the past. So I want to spend a few minutes and talk about this particular issue, because one of the, and that is it a turr or a murre? And surprisingly, once you start interviewing hunters, you suddenly realize there's a big, huge gap between the science and the hunter. And I'll get into this in terms of some particulars in a few minutes. Even the language that you use. For example, when I did a pre-test of two hunters before I started, and I started talking about thick-billed murre and common murre, and I suddenly realized that these individuals really did not, or were confused by the concepts of common murre and thick-billed murre, even though we normally use it in our, in our normal vernacular as birders or as scientists or whatever. So, for example, the use of the word turr in some parts of the province is meant to refer to the common murre, whereas the word murre is sometimes used to is used to refer to the northern or the thick-billed murre, and they look at them as essentially, they don't realize that actually a turr is a murre. And you will find, in fact, differences in local language use. For example, the use of the word of eyeglass bird, which is sometimes used in Bonavista North to refer to the common murre, and the northern bird they use to describe the thick-billed murre. Some people use the word auerbird to reference a common murre, or bacaloo bird. Tinker to describe a razorbill. So as a researcher, you need to be very, very aware of the differences in language, and not only dialects, but I'm talking about how they describe particular birds. And that came across very, very clearly in the initial pretest, to the point where what I did for the second round, because it varied from community to community, is I actually printed off pictures of the various birds in different plumage and asked them to tell me and to identify what those birds were, so that at least during the interview process, I knew what they were talking about. So I'm going to just briefly talk about three species here: common murre, thick-billed murre, and razorbill. And I'm not going to get into the Latin names. And it's interesting, when I first started writing up my proposal, I started using the word turr, and every time there was net, it came back as common murre, thick-billed murre, and also, make sure you put the Latin names in italics and all that kind of wonderful stuff. So let's talk a bit about the common murre. The common murre primarily, and some of this was discussed by Bill last week, and I'll add a little bit more probably flavor to it here, and Bill could do this with his eyes closed. So they're estimated, and this is all public information, by the way. So they're estimated about 25 Newfoundland colonies, of which there are roughly almost 800,000 breeding pairs, of which 96,000 are in Quebec. So knowing that it takes roughly between 2 to 3 years for the fledged birds to come back to breeding on some of these islands. So allowing for non-breeding, the population of common murres was estimated, and this is recent information that's posted right now. So the estimated population is around 3.2 million of common murres. Distribution, most of you know this already. The distribution of the common murres, primarily coastal Labrador and down into the Gulf, but most of them are around Newfoundland, with the bulk of them being in the area of the Funk Islands. And there's a small breeding population, for example, on Cabot Island in Bonavista Bay, which has about, I think, somewhere around 7,000 nesting pairs. There's also a small population in the west coast of the island as well, up Alaska, primarily Alaska. Thick-billed murre, which is most often referred to as northern bird. The Canadian breeding population estimated at 1.5 million, which totals 5.5 million when non-breeding birds are added. Now, the interesting thing about these birds is that roughly 75% of the birds that are that are harvested in Newfoundland are actually thick-billed murres and not common murres. And I'll get into a discussion in a little while about why that's the case. Distribution primarily, again, northern latitudes, breeding populations up on Gava Bay and north, coast of Green. There's also populations of thick-billed murre along the coast, the northern coast of Greenland, and I believe as well into Iceland and some of the islands in northern latitudes. This is a typical this is called, I guess, the long distance swimmers of the thick-billed murres, and this actually were tag birds that came off Prince Leopold Island. And essentially, and we've all seen some of these shots of these birds jumping off the cliffs, and some being picked off by foxes and seagulls and so on, and others making to the ocean. So, but basically, what happens here is when they fledge and jump off the cliff, obviously they're not able to fly, but they're accompanied primarily by the male, and they start this long distance swim as fast as they can to get away from these islands where they're breeding. There's another major breeding colony, for example, off Digges Island, which is right at the northern tip of Quebec. And I'll talk a bit about Digges Island in a minute as well. So basically, these swim roughly about 1,000 miles, not flying, but swimming, and basically enter an area around the Labrador Sea that's relatively ice-free. And there they then primarily the fledgling is fed by its father. The mother has left, the female has left and migrated long before that swim takes place. And they essentially gather in the area of the Labrador Sea. Now, the birds that we are getting here are not, I suspect, are not coming from this population. They're coming from, I know they're coming, for example, from Digges Island because of tagging that took place in the 90s. And some of these birds were harvested off Newfoundland, and that was done, I think, by guys like Richard Elliott and Pierre Ryan and so on, that were very avid or very proactive in this business earlier in their careers. So the other bird I just want to talk about very, very briefly, and it's not a bird that's hunted, it's a bird that's illegal to be hunted here. And that's the razorbill, locally called tinker. And the name of this particular bird is universal right across the island. I think wherever you go on the island, people know what a razorbill is. And I just want to talk about this very briefly. The distribution primarily is around, breeding is primarily around the coast of Newfoundland, and it non-breeding migration down the coast of the US, but primarily it's here all year round. The problem is this from a hunting perspective, and that is this is the razorbill. Oops, sorry, let me backtrack. So razorbill on the top left, thick-billed on the top right, and the common murre in the bottom. And if you look, these plumages are very, very similar to each other. Keep in mind, you're not, the razorbill in the top left is not a bird that's permissible to be hunted. However, the problem is this: it's an incidental bird, and that is, for example, here in this picture, you'll see it's a picture I took off of, I think, off Lumsden, razor and the common murre on the right. Is that if you're out hunting and these birds are traveling together in a flock, many of these birds get shot in the process. And of the 30 hunters that I interviewed for this study, only two said that they had never shot a razorbill, and all of them have indicated at different times that they have harvested razorbills accidentally, and they know what it is. But when it's mixed in with a bunch of other turrs, common and thick-billed, it's very, very difficult, particularly when you're in a swell. You're bouncing around the boat. Visibility is not great. You're a little bit excited about what you see in front of you, and very often some of these birds are harvested. I don't know what the numbers are, and I don't think anybody really knows what that number is. Um, Most hunters I talked to said they typically leave it in the water. Other hunters have said they will bring it in if there's no risk of if there's no risk of getting caught. Some hunters have been fined for having razorbills in their boat, but not many. There's a bunch of razorbills in flight, and you can see if you're out on a boat on a windy day, and this flock of birds come by at about 30, 40 kilometers an hour, and you're an eager hunter, it becomes very easy to mistake a razorbill. So what's important here is a policy implication. If hunters are having difficulty, for example, when I asked the question if they're able to identify common murres and thick-billed murres, if they're able to differentiate them on the water while hunting, only about roughly 15% of hunters said that they could differentiate them. All other hunters said that they couldn't. So the problem now is from a policy point of view, and that is if you're a conservation, you're setting conservation policy, and you end up with a situation where you have a collapse in one of those populations, whether it's razorbills or thick-billed or common, then the only option really that's available to you is to curtail the entire hunt, simply because of the difficulty of being able to pick out and pick out one species above another one. So this is a very, very important issue, particularly in the context of avian influenza. For example, if research at some point in time determines that this population has been hit so hard that the population of common murres is unsustainable, and one of the effects and one of the impacts is hunting, then it basically means that you have to shut down the entire hunt for all turr species. So I want to talk a little bit about the research methodology. There's two basic strategies. One is quantitative, where that's a lot of us are very, very familiar with that approach. Is basically things like counting birds or putting tags on them and so on. And the other one is qualitative. And qualitative research has its roots in the social sciences and is becoming more and more pronounced and much more used now in seabird research. And it's not only seabird research, but other types of research. And in the case of Canadian Wildlife Service, for example, as a part of their mandate of any major changes in their regulations, they're required to enter a consultative process, which in effect is a form of qualitative research. And in one particular case, for example, and where it turned out to be really, really effective, was the work of Pierre Ryan, Richard Elliott, and others in the 90s, who basically went around the province and interviewed hunters and lived in their communities, got quite a bit of credibility and so on from these hunters. And as a matter of fact, I interviewed several hunters who can remember when Pierre Ryan and Elliot, went into Bonavista North, held public meetings and so on. And out of that came a really input from hunters respecting the changes that were made in 1994 to establish limits and basically tighten up the regulations shown around the murre hunt. So one of the issues with qualitative research is how valid is it? How at what point in time do you get to a point where you've got enough information? And there is a concept in qualitative research called saturation, and that is most research is suggesting that once you get to about 12 interviews, and it depends on the topic, but typically around 12 to 15 interviews, after that point in time, what happens is that you get to a point where there's not much new information coming forward. And I found this as well, even though I interviewed 30 hunters in Bonavista from Cape Frios to Cape Bonavista, I found that by about 10 to 12 interviews, the information that was coming forward, a lot of it was not new. But at the same time, because you had this information, you kept going and you got into more detail on some of these concepts that were raised. So one of the two of the major objectives of the study was whether hunters could contribute towards the regulation and management of the seabird hunt, especially with respect to the current regulatory regime. And the other part was, can you use information that hunters had gathered over time, and can that be used to detect changes in the distribution and abundance of murres in Bonavista Bay, and also to attribute reasons for those changes? And so each of the so what I want to what I, another point that I want to make at this point in time is hunting is only one type of impact caused by humans. And we can get into a discussion as to whether it's a major impact, minor impact, or whatever, but I'm not going to dwell on this in the context of this particular presentation. We have fishing impacts, oil impacts, industrial waste. And I remember several hunters talking to me about um, a blackback turbot or backpack flounder fishery that took place in Bonavista North as a trial fishery immediately after the cod moratorium. And basically, you had nets placed in relatively close proximity to some of these where these seabirds hung out, particularly where turrs hung out, and they were getting during that short period of time as many as anywhere in the range of 300 to 500 drowned turrs per net, which is phenomenal when you think about the fact that there were hundreds of these nets that were in the water inshore during this period, or near shore during this period of time. So thank God that fishery was only an experimental fishery and was stopped because the impacts could have been much more significant. So I just want to go back to this one. This is a picture I took when we were out on the Lady Easton, and we had bright lights shining to attract in shearwaters for tagging. And I would say probably 30% of the birds that came near the boat attracted by the lights were actually turrs, common turrs. So obviously light has an impact on their behavior. They just kept trying to jump up aboard the boat. So I want to keep an open mind about turr hunting and not throw all the hunters under the bus. You do get some hunters out there that are clearly stretching the regs and breaking the regs. but by and far, the majority of them honest, are honest hunters. Um, so the estimated number of turrs harvested in Newfoundland and the recent data that we've got is between 60 to 120,000, and 75% are thick-billed murres. Now the fact that the majority of them are thick-billed murres has an important implication. I'll get into that discussion as well in a few minutes, and mindful of time here because I want to try to stop around 8:15 or so. So what's interesting about those numbers is that, first of all, I'm not sure that those numbers are correct. One of the methods that they use for gathering this information are hunter harvest surveys. And of 30 hunters that I interviewed, not one of them completed a harvest survey. So I know there are special surveys that CWS uses, but I am not convinced. I don't know what that number is, and I don't think that CWS is comfortable with this number because I know they're reviewing the methodology. And to have that range of 60 to 120,000 tells me that there's not a lot of confidence in a number. However, in comparison, say to the 80s, where you had, probably upwards of 800,000 murres killed, this is a significant decline in harvested birds. So essentially what I did was I interviewed 30 hunters from July of 2021 ending March of 2022. And essentially I used a technique called snowball sampling, where if I knew a hunter, I got that hunter to go and recommend other hunters. And I essentially moved from Bonavista North right around. So I hit all the major regions in Bonavista Bay from Cape Friels to Cape Bonavista. So the study area, I don't really need to say, basically Cape Friels, Cape Bonavista, and you basically have an area of about 3,200 square kilometers with about 45 communities where you have registered hunters. I'll just skip this one in the interest of time. These interviews basically took place in, stages. I took the snow-covered garage in there for a bit of fun, but actually took place in people's garages, round kitchen tables, and these are just stock photos, by the way. But the last one, which is the guy playing the guitar, and that actually I had two experiences similar to that, where I end up having to postpone the interview because there's just too many people came in and with their beer and their guitars and so on. And so I went back and redid the interviews when it was a bit quieter. So I want to touch on this for a minute. Let's sort of, I want to dispel this myth. There is this notion that you see in the literature every now and then, including in some of the scientific literature, that for some reason or another that the turr hunt, as we know it today was a precondition for Newfoundland to join Confederation in 1949. This, in fact, is far from the truth. Um, the day after, effectively, the day after which was April the 1st, 1949, the right to hunt turrs in Newfoundland ceased to exist. We became subject to the Migratory Birds Convention Act, which was federal legislation. And in that legislation, the hunting of any kind of seabirds, including all turrs, thick-billed and common murres, became illegal. And the Migratory Convention, Birds Convention, is a treaty between Canada and the U.S. and I think Mexico and some of the other countries have also joined on since then. And the Migratory Birds Convention Act is actually the Canadian counterpart of that legislation. And in the US, the Migratory Birds Convention has its own corresponding US legislation as well. So what basically happened is about several months after Newfoundland joined Confederation, people suddenly realized that they could not hunt turrs. And essentially, there was a significant, massive uprising right across the province with individuals essentially saying that, not essentially, they were very, very clear on this, unequivocal, that if they had known that they could not hunt turrs, Newfoundlanders would not have joined Canada. And it didn't, and to some extent, it really was irrelevant because if you joined the US, you still had the same problem because of the Migratory Birds Convention. But they used that very, very skillfully to get the feds to back off and to allow the hunt to continue under certain conditions. And that is that the hunt basically had to be used for subsistence. And what's interesting about this is the fact that by doing that, the feds were actually in violation of the treaty between the US and Canada, because the treaty between US and Canada very, very clearly banned the hunting of turtles. So I don't know if any of you know Bruce Turner, who is now retired with Canadian Wildlife Service. But Bruce has done a tremendous job of preparing a manuscript which lays out the internal workings of these pieces of legislation and followed it through to the current situation, and also does a very sort of in-depth look at the inner workings of all this, what went on in the minds of the legislators, the Americans that were party to the Migratory Birds Convention, and so on. So basically, what happened is that despite there being legislation, the feds agreed for the hunt to continue. However, the problem was that there was no enforcement of that legislation. So what essentially happened is there was from 1949 onwards, depending on technology, there was an old scale, and I don't want to use the word slaughter of turrs, but it was the Wild West of hunting of turrs right around the island. And it was not until 1994 that the legislation was eventually changed, including the Migratory Birds Convention, that recognized the right of Newfoundlanders or non-Aboriginal Newfoundlanders to hunt turrs, or the two species. And then subsequently, the regulations were changed in the Act as well to permit hunting of murres um, by non-Aboriginal Newfoundlanders, and essentially is the only seabird hunt in North America right now. So what was really interesting, and the reason why I brought up this notion of historical rights, is that there's an important implication. When I interviewed the hunters, 90% of the hunters felt they had an historical right to hunt murres, with the majority stating not because of Confederation, but rather because their ancestors did it and it was a part of their culture. In fact, if you start digging deeper, what some of the questions that I asked is, for example, all the turr hunters basically hunted other species. And I'm not talking about seabirds, I'm talking about moose, grouse, rabbit. So turrs became sort of still a form of subsistence um, hunt in some respects. So what was further interesting is that when I dug a lot deeper into this, is that all the hunters felt that this right should not be at all costs, and that is, if turns were at risk, they would relinquish that right temporarily, and that is, they would would have no difficulty, would support a ban on the hunting of turtles, and in fact, all hunters, and I mean 30 of them, were unequivocal in this position. However, the caveat was that if their observations, there was a complete mistrust of science and mistrust of regulators. And a lot of that seemed to be coming from their issues that they were having. A lot of these people, for example, were fishermen or had experience, with their issues with DFO. Many of the fights, many of them were involved in these sorts of issues. With the cod moratorium and changes in the quotas and crab and all this kind of stuff, and as well the closure of the seal hunt. So there's this mistrust of science. There was this antagonism that exists towards those in any kind of position of authority that where they felt that that right might be taken away from them. But surprisingly, they would be prepared to give that up if they felt that the populations were in jeopardy. The problem is is that how do they know if the population is in jeopardy? What I found from doing the interviews was that hunters have very, very narrow, restricted hunting areas. They have traditional hunting grounds, so their vision and concept of a terror abundance or population was based on what they saw in front of them, how the hunt went that year. So they had very little knowledge of the overall populations of and health of the populations worldwide. So they really didn't know. For example, they would they would go out, they would get their quota, no problems at all, and their interpretation of that would be that there's lots of turrs around. When in fact it might be a distribution. You might have a weather event that pushed all of the turrs that were in that area into the bay, and consequently that was how they might have interpreted um, population health. So the policy implication here is that if you have a population of people who believe that they have historical hunting rights and there's distrust of science and regulators, then you can expect to see some sort of backlash from hunters if they're not consulted and the science is not consistent with their observations. So if you get inside the headspace of those inside of, for example, Canadian Wildlife Service, they're well aware of what happened in the 50s and 60s and 70s and the incredible difficulties that they had to try to get some order to hunting in Newfoundland. It became a very, very political event. And if you are now faced with a position, even though they don't need, the CWS has emergency powers, they can shut the hunt down whenever they can. They have rights they have an ability to change the regulations and go through a consultative process, but still they're not bound by the consultative process. So you can imagine the sort of quandary that if you're the one that's going to make the decision and you're aware of this background, you know that this exists, and clearly it exists to this day, certainly in Bonavista Bay, and I can only speak for Bonavista Bay, but then you're going to be very, very careful about how you approach any future changes in the entire area of the regulatory environment. So the current regulations that were put in place came in 1994. There are already a series of zones. Bonavista Bay is in Zone 4. They all have different opening and closing dates, with Zone 4, which is Bonavista Bay, having two. November 1st, so it'll be starting up pretty soon, to January 8th, and February 2nd to March 10th. Now, this November 1st date is fairly important, particularly with respect to the Cabot Island population. Typically, common murres, when they fledge, tend to move inland. Now, it's a little bit different for the Funk Island birds. The Funk Island birds, when they fledge, head very, very quickly out towards the Grand Banks. And I mean, some of them obviously come inshore, but the Cabot Island birds are a little bit different in that they tend to hang around inside of Cabot Island and around Cabot Island. So they're within, 10, 12 kilometers of the shore, and tend to disperse around the bay before they head out towards the outer edges of the Grand Banks. They're basically, at this point in time, they're fledging and so on. So we're fortunate in two things here in terms of the impacts on common murres in that particular bay. One is, for example, when I interviewed hunters prior to the start of hunting season, I got comments like the bay is black with turrs. They're everywhere. They're more than I've ever seen before. But the day that the hunt season opened up, there was hardly a turr that was seen in a common turr that was seen in Bonavista Bay. They were very, very scarce. So that's one thing that had happened, that the murres moved out of the common murres moved out of Bonavista Bay just prior to the opening of hunting season. The second thing that's important that came from these interviews is that very few hunters actually hunt prior to the second season, after Christmas. They rarely hunt. Some of them will go out, they'll just go out and grab a meal of birds. And there's only two hunters that I said that I talked to that went out and hunted before Christmas and didn't go out after Christmas. And primarily they were in smaller boats and were single hunters. They just didn't trust going out afterwards. And the reason why that these hunters didn't hunt and don't like hunting before Christmas is they refer to the birds as being moody. And that is, they're going through a plumage change and they're molting, and therefore you got a lot of pin feathers. And they just don't like the work that's involved in picking the pin feathers out of birds, even though a lot of them use waxes and the turr pickers and so on. But generally, most of the Bonavista Bay hunters I talk to prefer to wait until after Christmas when the birds are in better condition. So the current regulations max 20 birds per day and maximum in your possession is 40. But interesting, there's no seasonal limit. So therefore, you can, in practice, you can go out almost every day as long as you don't have 40 in your possession. So that means you need to dispose of those 40 by giving them to family members or whatever. I don't know of anybody that has done it every day. I know people that go out multiple times during the season, but it's not something that is practiced fairly regularly. I see. I better go fast. So this is an interesting stat, and this is a decline in the number of licensed hunters in Bonavista Bay. And what you see over just even a fine, I got this data, so I got raw data from CWS and went through it community by community and came up with this for Bonavista Bay. And that is a dramatic drop in the number of licensed hunters in Bonavista Bay, roughly by about 42%. So one of the questions, obviously, I was asking was, are there any of your family members planning on continuing hunting and so on? And of the 30 I interviewed, maybe 4 said they had a son or a daughter who was considering taking up hunting. And in fact, very few of the younger people now were even interested in hunting, instead preferring, fast food, and we're not into the culture of hunting. So you are going to see this continued decline over time, unquestionably. And Newfoundland is not the only area where you're seeing this. This is happening in Japan, the US, and other countries, Finland, for example, in the number of licensed hunters, and is presenting a problem in some of those other countries simply because the selling of the taxes on guns and ammo and license fees are used almost exclusively for conservation purposes. So now you're seeing a decline in conservation revenue. So the policy implication here of that is obviously less hunting pressure, potentially. However, what may be left is a core of very, very strong, dedicated hunters with better technology. And in fact, you may see, because of larger motors and so on, in fact, heavier hunting pressure. But generally, you will find, I think, overall, less numbers of people on the water, I think. So this is a map I gave the hunters. Basically, what I found was when I used a generic map, I was a little used to them. And then what I was using this for was to get them to tell me what routes they took and so on. So I asked them to plot for me the typical routes that they follow. And this was pretty revealing. First of all, what happened over time, and it's not showing on this one, I've got it on another one, where uh, prior to the like 70s and 80s, or even up to a decade ago, much of the hunting took place very near shore, 5, 6 kilometers in, actually into bays and deep into bays in a lot of cases. In the last 10 years, there's been a movement of those murres out of the bay for a number of different reasons. So hunters now are tending to have a travel longer distances. There are those hunters that, for example, here you can see the density of hunters that are hunting routes that are around Cabot Island, Flowers Island. Another typical route is area for hunting is down off the Offer Islands, off Cape Bonavista, and off Cape Frios. So what that's showing me is that when you talk to these hunters and you hear them talk about, well, the the hunters are where the birds are where the bait is, and if there's no bait, there's no birds, and winds have to be in a certain direction, and ice is a problem, and so on. And I've got quite a bit of material that we've taken a look at for my master's research on the environmental factors now that's influencing the distribution of birds in Bonavista Bay. So what you're finding though is the emergence of individuals with larger motors and so on, and they're wandering all the time. These people are out here. If you look at the distances, these people are out. They're outside of land. They're in the vicinity of 40, 50 kilometers out. In fact, some of these guys said they've left Bonavista North and gone over where they've seen actually people putting clothes on the lines in Bonavista. So you have two types of hunt or three types of hunt that are taking place here. One is off the capes, which is tends to be in closer. The hunting is different in that they're primarily shooting birds while they're flying. And the same thing off Cape Frios. The hunters off Cape Frios are going out very, very small distances. And primarily they're after what essentially are the thick-billed murres that are flying down from cape to cape. So basically St. Anthony and flying across and heading out very quickly to the Grand Banks. And in fact, the hunters believe that these birds that are coming down here that are flying thick-billed murres are actually wrapping around the island, ending up in Placentia Bay. I'm not so sure about that. I think maybe these birds are heading on out to the Grand Banks, but I don't know because I haven't seen any tracking data. But what this is clearly showing is that these are hot spots where you've got bait, birds, whales, and also where you've got fishing, inshore fishing activities. So what you have is almost like eco hotspots. One exists, for example, between Cabot Island inside the Flowers Island, in the vicinity of Gull Island, off of Cape Frios, off the Offer Islands, and clearly off Cape Bonavista out to about 10 or 15. And actually, several of the hunters tell me that they see whales there wintertime as well. So it's rather interesting that you can use this data to highlight and pick up sensitive coastal regions of the province that probably need some attention in different ways. So one of the I'm running out of time, so I'll bring it to an end very, very quickly. So one of the um, issues that came up, which was very, very surprising, which is also very, very important, and that is there's a general lack of scientific knowledge within the birding community. They, um, most do not know where thick-billed murres breed. They don't know relative health of the populations. They know very little about plumage variations. They know just about every one of them knew that that murres laid only one egg. They knew that common murres breed on Cabot, and most speculated that murres were on Funk Islands. Um, so that presents a real problem because this issue was also identified by Elliott and Ryan in the surveys in the 80s and 90s. And why we have not used hunter education as a means of building linkages and stronger relationships between hunters and the general particularly on the regulatory side scientists and so on. I guess it's primarily because the focus has been on more quantitative scientific research as opposed to reaching into these communities and basically using hunters and other individuals in these communities to be essentially on the forefront of identifying environmental changes and environmental impacts on murres, and also trying to bridge this gap between science and local knowledge. And I look at this as really as an opportunity. It's really a potential backdoor into bridging this gap between hunters and scientists and regulators. We just need to figure out the mechanism by which we do it. And unfortunately, given the state of technology in rural Newfoundland, particularly internet, for example, none of the hunters, of the 30 hunters that I interviewed, used Facebook. Um, they sometimes dropped in on Facebook and looked. As a matter of fact, some of them were very condescending towards the Facebook users, saying they're doing a disservice to us hunters and et cetera and et cetera. But so therefore, how do you go about uh, getting input, getting hunters engaged in a process? And I think the work that CWS did in the 90s is a good example, a great example of how they should go about this and do it. Right now, the process is regulatory change is drafted and then it's sent out for public comment and et cetera. But I think if they were to start engaging hunters before the regulations were changed, then I think it would have a much more significant impact. Hunters are talking about, I've got additional slides on here, but it's now 8:30. So I'm going to just sort of shut this down pretty quickly and just hit some key points. And that is that hunters are fully engaged are there to support changes to the regulations. For example, the hunters I interviewed were very supportive of looking at a seasonal limit on birds, whether it's through tags or something like that. But there are a significant number of hunters that are supportive of the regulations and will continue to be supportive of regulation and will support change if it's in the interests of preserving the hunt and also protecting the species. So I had, just thought about getting into a bit about the history of it, but I just want to get to one point. I'll skip this one. And that is talk a bit about the entire issue of changes in the regulations. And that is, while hunters, 100% of the hunters support the regulations, there are some minor changes that they're suggesting would be tweaked. For example, changes in the number. Right now, there's a limit of 3 shots in your barrel, and they've made suggestions that maybe that's irrelevant, and I understand the reason why that's irrelevant, because they figured out how to circumvent that so they're not caught. And matter of fact, one hunter said to me that there probably isn't a single weapon in Bonavista North that has the original manufacturer's plug in the gun that cannot be changed very, very quickly. So I'm going to sort of leave it at that. I mean, and open it up for questions if there's any, and take it from there. And I guess I'll stop sharing here somehow.
Thank you very much, Wayne. That was great. Super interesting. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions if you have questions, or you can put them in the chat. I've been keeping an eye on it and I don't see any there right now.
Perfect. I like that.
I mean, I have a question if nobody else has one, and I don't see anything popping up. And you may or may not know the answer to this, but why is it that you can't hunt razorbills? Were they not traditionally hunted, or are razorbill populations in trouble? What's the reasoning behind that?
I think the I don't have the exact numbers on the razorbill populations, but I know they're substantially lower. They're not anywhere near the levels of common and thick-billed murres. The distribution is primarily around the island. The other thing is I don't think they were a traditional hunted bird. The Newfoundlanders used to hunt a significant number of seabirds. As a matter of fact, one of the questions I asked was, what other seabirds do you think should be hunted? And for example, shearwaters was identified as one, like kittiwakes, and so on. And these were traditionally hunted birds in Newfoundland prior to the 90s. I know growing up as a kid, we ate shearwaters. I knew we ate kittiwakes. I knew we ate, some of those birds. So I suspect it's more related to what birds were traditionally hunted as opposed to anything else.
That's interesting, though. If I mean, presumably this difficulty telling the difference between the species of murres and the razorbill is not a recent thing. So presumably it also used to be a problem that people misidentified them. And so did they just not eat them, I wonder? Maybe razorbills don't taste good.
They whatever you shot, you ate.
Okay.
It didn't make any difference. It was anything that was on the water basically was killed. So it was rather interesting how technology has changed in this hunt, and I think the next generation of regulations are going to acknowledge that. You've got people out there with two 150 engines on them. You've got you've got GPS. You've got cell phone coverage. In fact, cell phone coverage is better out in Bonavista Bay than it is inshore. So the moment an enforcement officer is on the water, they know about it. They can communicate with each other, and whether there's birds on one side of the bay or wherever. So anyway.
Any other questions? I have one more, but I want to let other people have a chance to get in there.
I just quickly wanted to thank you, Wayne, for the presentation. It was great. I myself, and I know one of the other listeners here, are actually our graduate students at Grenfell campus, and we're actually soon going to be pursuing a project with CWS. And we were both really intrigued just by a lot of the information that you brought forward and a lot of the techniques that you used. And I guess I don't want to put you on the spot or anything, but I would just like to open the invitation that if you would be comfortable working with us in the future and, giving us some insight, because, looking at murres and the whole dynamic with the hunters is kind of what we want to look into. And I think that you would be a great asset to us in the future if that is something you'd be comfortable with. Or
yeah, I have no problems at all. Absolutely, would love to. There's certain lessons I learned in this. I'm from Bonavista Bay, and I knew a lot of these hunters, not a lot, but a fair number. And there were certain insights that I got that most other people wouldn't get. I had individuals show me how quickly they can change out the plug on the gun. I've had them all kinds of wonderful things like that. So you got to speak their language. That's the most important thing. But anyway, I'd be happy anytime at all. Absolutely.
Well, if it's okay with you, I might reach out to Catherine, if that's okay, and get Wayne's information, contact information.
No problem at all. Anytime.
Great. Yep. Thank you.
Yeah, just send us an email. And Wayne, there is a question in the chat now. So Carolyn says, there's such emphasis on how we've always done things in Newfoundland. So just, what's traditional. Is there wisdom underlying this, and can population biology improve on this approach?
That's a very good question, because what's happening is most of the older hunters are about to fall off the table, and that is they're losing interest. They're losing interest in hunting. They just don't. I mean, some of them you talk to, for example, were saying it was almost like an addiction and so on. So what I've sensed is that there is a big change and concern with respect to the health of the populations. And that was not something I've seen in the past. So there is a sentiment of environmentalism appearing among hunters that I don't think existed, certainly didn't exist in the 80s and 90s and up until 2000, but is clearly there now. And I think I think there's a real opportunity with the right kind of strategy to change all this. You know, albeit you got to keep in mind that from a philosophical point of view, their approach to conservation is one of conserving the species so we can hunt them, whereas others have a approach it from the other extreme, which is not the other extreme, but the other part of the continuum where humans shouldn't be involved in nature and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So, but I think you've got a willing population, you've got an educated population that's coming behind this, and you're going to have a smaller number. And I think they're wide open to change. I don't think there's any question about that. You'll find the ones on the fringes. I mean, all you need to do is look at Facebook and you'll see them. But by far, the bulk of them are not like that. Certainly, the 30 hunters that I interviewed are not like that. So.
Okay. Another question here from Marilyn, wanting to know if people sell some of the murres that they kill, and she's asked if there's a limit to how many birds they can kill a day. And I believe that was 20, correct?
20 and 40 in your possession, but no annual limit. And hunters that I interviewed suggested that there should be an annual limit on the number of murres killed.
And do they sell them? Do they sell the murres that they kill?
There is still put it this way, if I wanted to buy a turr, I can buy a turr, but it's not something that is readily available to someone that's not known. Like if someone walked in off the street and said, I want to buy a turr, they will give you one, but they will not sell you one, simply because, for a number of reasons. But there are, the regulations are flaunted by some, but not by all. And there are some that are still selling birds, but not large numbers like they were in the 80s and 90s by any stretch of the imagination. In the 80s and 90s, it was load and go. Right now you can buy a turr for $10, but it's very limited. It's not like it used to be, not by any stretch of the imagination, anywhere remotely close to it.
Got it. Okay. Don't see any more questions in the chat, so I'm going to take the opportunity to pose my second question. And I don't necessarily expect you to have an answer to this, but I'm curious because one of your conclusions seemed to be that hunter education might be an opening and a way to go. But you also said that hunters are very distrustful of science. So I'm wondering how you reconcile those two things. If you don't trust what you're being taught, then education isn't going to work. So how would you suggest educating hunters?
I think you've got to get into community meetings, and you've got not to be condescending as if you know everything, and you've got to ask hunter opinions, and you've got to involve them in discussions. And as a part of those discussions, you have to impart on them various pieces of knowledge, and they will gobble it up. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. The number of hunters that ask me questions, and we're glad to finally someone tell them some of these answers, was quite significant. And I do believe, without a doubt, that hunters would be open to it, but not if you're going into a room and telling them. It has to be a forum of consultation and discussion. That's the only way to approach this. It's give and take.
Fair enough. Yep, that seems like it would be the only way to approach it for sure. Do we have any other questions from anyone? Okay, I'm gonna say no, so we'll let you off the hot seat there, Wayne. But
Good.
thank you very much for your presentation tonight. Thanks for taking the time. We really appreciate it, and it's really cool to hear about the work that's happening with lots of Newfoundland bird species, and in this case, with such an interesting topic as the turr hunt.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we will be back again next week with another webinar.